The sealed bids on the Ellery Water Works were opened on a Wednesday morning in a second-floor conference room at City Hall on a folding table pushed against a wall of gray filing cabinets in front of 9 people who had come mostly because nothing else was happening in town that week. The city clerk, a heavy, calm woman named Harriet Voss, who had worked in that building for 22 years, slit the envelope with a letter opener shaped like a canoe paddle and unfolded a single sheet of paper. There was only one bid. The property had been advertised 4 times in 3 years. It sat at the top of Front Street where the pavement gives out and the river bends, and it consisted of one lot of a little under 2 acres. One red brick pump house with a slate roof and 11 tall arched windows down each side, one square brick chimney 110 feet high, a small brick office wing, a coal shed with no roof left on it, and a gravel yard grown up in mullein and sumac. The city had shut the plant down in 1979 when the new well field went in east of the highway, and had chained the doors that same autumn, and had spent the following 46 years mentioning the place at budget time and then not mentioning it again until the next budget. The reason nobody had bid on it before was not a secret. It had been printed in every notice. An engineering assessment done for the city 3 years earlier had found the chimney unsound above the 70-foot mark and had recommended it come down. The report had also found regulated insulating material on the steam piping throughout the building, which meant abatement, and it also found that the subgrade well pits under that end of the floor held standing water of unknown depth. The estimate at the back of that report, the one the council had read aloud so many times it had gone smooth as a river stone, was for demolition, abatement, and site clearance, and the estimate was $260,000. That figure was the whole story as far as Ellery was concerned. Whoever bought the waterworks was not buying a building. They were buying a bill that would come due the first day a piece of that chimney landed on Front Street. 3 parties had come and looked over the years. A man from a brick reclamation outfit downstate walked the yard for 20 minutes, counted the courses in the chimney, and left without going inside. A church group thought about the shell for a youth center until their insurance agent explained what he would and would not write. And a developer from the county seat had gotten as far as an option before his own engineer told him what the pits under the floor would cost to characterize. So Harriet Voss unfolded the one sheet of paper and read the name on it, and the name was Vera Lindquist. And the amount was $4,180. The room made a sound. It was not laughter exactly. It was the sound a small town makes when it is embarrassed on somebody's behalf, a kind of soft collective intake with a little cough at the end of it. A man standing near the door, a contractor who did concrete work and had come out of pure curiosity. Said out loud that Vera had just paid $4,000 in change for the privilege of owing $250,000, and 2 people laughed because laughing was easier than sitting there. Vera Lindquist was in the second row of folding chairs with a canvas tote bag on her knees. She was 73 years old. She was a small woman, thin through the wrists and shoulders, and she sat with her back very straight because she had been taught to, and because after a certain age it hurts less. Her hair was silver white and pinned back into a low bun she did herself every morning at the bathroom mirror. She wore a knit cardigan the color of oatmeal with both elbows darned over a pale blue cotton house dress with buttons up the front, brown stockings, and brown lace-up shoes that had been resoled twice. In the tote bag were her checkbook, a folded copy of the notice out of the Tolliver County Record, and a pair of cotton gloves. She did not turn around when the man by the door said what he said. She looked at Harriet Voss and waited. Harriet Voss looked back at her over the top of her glasses for what felt like a long moment, and then said that the bid met the published minimum, that there were no other bids, and that the council would take it up for confirmation at the meeting on the following Monday. She wrote the figure on a form. She asked Vera to sign the acknowledgement. Vera came forward and signed it with a ballpoint pen chained to the table, and her signature was small and upright and completely steady. And then she picked up her tote bag and said thank you and went down the stairs and out onto the sidewalk into a bright cold morning in mid-March. The council confirmed the sale on Monday in about 90 seconds. There was no discussion. One member asked whether the city was releasing itself from the chimney, and the city attorney said the sale was as is, where is, with no warranty of any kind, and that the buyer was taking the parcel and the improvements exactly as they stood. Another member said, and it went into the minutes this way, that he hoped somebody had explained to the lady what she was getting into. The vote was unanimous. Ellery is a river town of about 4,000 people, and Vera Lindquist had lived in it her entire life, except for the 2 years she and her husband spent in Rock Island right after they married. She had grown up on Delacourt Street in a house that is still there. Her father had driven a milk route. Her mother had done alterations at home for money and taken in ironing when the alterations were slow. For 19 years, from the time her younger boy started school until the city moved its billing to a service bureau in the county seat, Vera had worked in the utility office on the ground floor of City Hall. She had typed water bills, entered meter readings off the route cards, made up the shut-off notices, and taken payments at the window from people she had known her whole life. She knew, better than almost anybody left alive in that town, where the water came from and how it got to the houses, because for 19 years she had been the person who wrote down what it cost. Her husband was Ansel Lindquist, a machinist. He worked 31 years at a shop on the south edge of town that made and repaired pump parts, bearing housings, shaft sleeves, impellers, and for a good part of that time, the shop's steadiest customer had been the city, and the city's steadiest need had been the 2 engines at the waterworks. Ansel had been inside that pump house perhaps 200 times. He was not a sentimental man about much. He was sentimental about those engines. He had died 4 years earlier in February of a thing that took 11 months and did not leave much of him by the finish, and Vera had sat with him for most of it, and one of the last full conversations they had on an afternoon when he was clear was about the waterworks and what would become of it. But the reason Vera bid on that building went back further than her husband. In the spring of her 6th grade year, her class had walked from the school down Delacourt to Front Street on a field trip, and a man named Reuben Kastner, who was the chief operator then, had let them in and had talked to them for an hour, and had let each child in turn come up onto the operating floor and lay one hand flat on a moving crosshead as it went slowly past. She could remember it in her body more than in words. The floor was warm. The air smelled of hot oil and of something like clean laundry. There was a sound that was not loud, but that you felt in the middle of your chest, a long, steady breathing sound with a soft knock in it at the far end of each stroke, and the whole enormous machine went up and down without hurrying. And Reuben Kastner said that it had been going like that, day and night, since before any of their grandmothers was born, and that it would keep going after all of them were gone. He was wrong about the second part, and Vera had spent 61 years knowing that he was wrong, and every one of those years she had driven or walked past that building at the end of Front Street and looked at it. The bid was not a symbolic number. It was very close to everything she had that was not the house. She had a widow's benefit and a small pension from the city and a certificate of deposit that had been Ansel's insurance money, and she had cashed part of that certificate in February and taken the penalty. She had also priced the taxes on the parcel, which came to $190 a year, and she had decided she could carry that. Her daughter Corinne called from Davenport on the Tuesday after the council vote, having heard it from her cousin. Corinne was 51 and worked in medical billing and was, as she said several times during that conversation, only asking questions because somebody had to. She asked whether her mother understood that the chimney was condemned. She asked whether her mother had any idea what abatement cost. She asked whether anybody at the city had walked her through this, or whether they had simply taken the check from a 73-year-old woman and gone to lunch. She asked, near the end, what exactly her mother thought she was going to do with a 110-foot smokestack. Vera said she did not know yet. Corinne said that was the part that worried her. Her son Warren, who lived in Colorado and called on Sundays, took it differently. He laughed and said it sounded like something his dad would have done. Then he asked her, seriously, whether she needed money, and she said no. The closing was done in the back office of a title company on Sedgwick Street in 20 minutes on the last Friday in March. Vera brought a cashier's check. There was no lender, no survey, no inspection, and no closing statement worth the paper because there was almost nothing to prorate. A young woman named Tilda ran the papers and had clearly been told something about the transaction beforehand because she was careful and kind, as people are when they think somebody is making a mistake. The deed itself was 1 page. Underneath the granting language there was a legal description that ran 9 lines, and underneath that a paragraph in small type that had been carried forward from an older instrument. Tilda read the granting clause out loud, as title companies do, and skipped over the description, as everyone does, because a legal description is a set of directions, not a sentence. And nobody reads directions to a place they are already standing. Then she handed across an envelope with the keys, and there were only 2 of them, both of them long and old, on a wire ring with a paper tag gone the color of weak tea. She went down there the same afternoon. She parked on the gravel and sat for a minute with the engine off. Up close, the building was bigger than it was from the road, as things you have looked at all your life can turn out to be. And the brick was a deep red gone soft and flowery at the mortar lines, and the arched windows on the riverside had been boarded from the inside with plywood that had weathered pale. Above the double doors there was a limestone panel with a wreath carved into it and nothing else. The chimney stood off the northeast corner and went up and had a band of iron around it near the top and a hawk sitting on the band. The chain on the doors was not the original chain. Somebody had replaced it at some point with a heavier one and a padlock that had rusted into a solid lump. Vera had thought about this and had brought bolt cutters that had belonged to Ansel, and she was not strong enough to close them on that chain, and she stood there in the wind off the river for a while, feeling foolish, and then she drove to the hardware store on Sedgwick and asked whether there was anybody who could cut a padlock for her. That is how she met Theo Bracken. He was 26, tall, and had the loose, careful movements of somebody who has been taught to work around machinery. He had been a millwright's apprentice at a grain terminal until the terminal automated the leg and cut 9 positions, and he had been doing odd jobs since November and was not proud of it. He put a battery grinder and a face shield in the back of his truck and followed her out to Front Street and cut the padlock in about 40 seconds. And then he stood looking up at the building with his hands in his pockets while she pulled the chain out of the door handles link by link and coiled it on the ground. The doors were oak, 12 feet tall, and they had swelled. He got the left one moving. It came inward with a long sound like a held breath. Inside the entry, there was a small, dark vestibule with a terrazzo floor and a bench built into the wall, and dead leaves that had come under the door over half a century, and a wall of little brass hooks with nothing on them. There was a smell that was not mold. It was cold iron and old oil, and the mineral smell of a place that stays the same temperature all year. To the left was the office wing, 3 rooms with a counter, a wooden desk, a swivel chair on its side, and a wall of shallow drawers. To the right, a door with a glass panel in it, and through the glass, gray light. Vera opened that door. She had prepared herself for the building. She had not prepared herself for the room. The engine hall ran 180 feet from where she stood to the far wall, and it was 3 stories tall and open clear to the roof. And 11 arched windows down each side went from waist height to within 4 feet of the ceiling. Most of them were boarded on the outside sash, but the upper lights of the arches were not. And through them the March sun came in 11 long slanting bars on each side, so the whole enormous space was striped with light and full of drifting dust, and overhead, running the length of the hall on rails set into the brick, hung a traveling crane painted a green so dark it read as black, and under the crane stood the 2 engines. Vera Lindquist stopped inside the doorway with one hand still on the frame. They were bigger than she had carried them in her memory, and she had carried them large. Each one stood on a stone foundation that came up 2 feet above the floor, and from that foundation the machine went up and up past the level of a second-floor gallery and past the level of a third. And the top of the high-pressure cylinder head on the nearer engine was, she learned later, 40 feet and 4 inches above the operating floor. Each engine had 3 cylinders in a row of increasing size, cast iron, lagged-in wood staving with polished brass bands around them. Above each cylinder was an entablature carried on 4 fluted columns, and the columns were not plain columns. They were cast with a bead down each flute and a molded cap, because in 1908, a machine like this was understood to be a public building's furniture and was made to be looked at. Between the columns, in the shadow, hung the crossheads and the connecting rods, and below them the crankshaft ran along a bed plate the length of a boxcar. And at one end of each crankshaft sat a flywheel 18 feet across with a rim you could have laid a dinner plate on flat. Everything metal that was not painted was under a skin of hardened grease that somebody had put there on purpose. The floor was checker plate, and where the light hit it, it was clean. She walked out into the middle of the hall. Her shoes made a small dry sound. She walked down the whole side of the first engine and stood at the far end where the flywheel came down almost to the floor and looked up the whole height of the thing, and the sun bars crossed it at 3 levels, and there were pigeons somewhere up in the crane girders that she could hear but not see. Theo Bracken came in behind her and said one word, which was not a word, and then did not say anything else for a long time. Vera put out her hand and laid it flat on the steel of the crosshead guide, which was cold and slick with grease, and she stood there like that with her palm on it. They spent the rest of that afternoon in the building and did not get through half of it. Behind the engines, along the back wall, was the boiler room. 4 horizontal boilers in brick settings, with their fronts still bolted up, and the piping overhead wrapped in the insulation that had made the engineers write what they wrote. Vera made a note not to touch any of it and to keep everyone else from touching it, and she meant that note, and she kept it. North of the engine hall was the pit gallery, where the pump ends went down into the ground, and a steel rail with a chain across it, and below the chain black water perfectly still, and the tops of 2 enormous vertical pump barrels standing out of it like the shoulders of something asleep. That was what the report had meant by pits of unknown depth. Vera looked at it for a while and decided the depth could remain unknown a little longer. In the office wing, they found the desk, and in the desk, they found a drawer that had swollen shut and came open with a screwdriver, and in the drawer, there was a bound ledger with a marbled cover. It was the operating log. It ran from January of 1971 to the last entry, and the entries were made in 3 different hands over those years, and the last hand was a small, back-slanted script that stayed steady down to the bottom of the final page. Boiler pressures, water pumped in millions of gallons, bearing temperatures, oil consumed, notes on the weather, and on what had been repacked or adjusted. On the 14th of October, 1979, The same small hand had written that the east engine had been shut down at 4:15 in the afternoon, that the west engine had been shut down at 5:10, that both had been barred over by hand to bottom center, that the cylinders and rod packings had been coated, that all polished surfaces had been coated, that the crane had been run to the north end and secured, and that the plant was in the condition described in the standing order for extended layup. Under that, on the last line, the same hand had written a sentence that was not a log entry. It said that the engines were in good order, that they had never once failed to make water for the city, and that whoever came next should know that. It was signed. The signature was Orval Kastner. Vera sat down in the swivel chair with the ledger open on her knees. Reuben Kastner had let a sixth-grade girl put her hand on a moving crosshead in the spring of 1964. Orval Kastner was Reuben's son. Vera had gone to school 2 years behind him. She had not thought about him in a long time, and she was not sure whether he was still living, and it turned out that he was, out east of town on the Hollis Road, 91 years old, in the house he had built himself in 1958. But that came later. What came first was Theo Bracken walking the engines end to end for 2 hours with a flashlight and coming back to her with an expression she could not read. He said that he had worked on machinery his whole short working life and that he had never seen anything like the condition of this. He said that the grease was not neglect, it was a coating, applied deliberately and thickly and evenly, and that under it, where he had cleaned a patch on the low-pressure piston rod with a rag, the steel came up bright with the original grinding marks still on it. He said the cylinder drains had been left open. He said the bearing caps had been slacked off a half-turn each, which is what you do so a bearing does not take a set, and that somebody had gone around and done all of them. He said the crosshead shoes were shimmed, and the shims were still in place and lined up. He said the whole plant had not been abandoned. It had been put to bed. Vera asked whether the engines could be made to run. Theo said he had no business having an opinion. Then he said that if you had boilers and he was not going to be the one to fire those boilers, and if you had a competent millwright in about 4 months, he thought they would run, and that he did not know how to explain the feeling of standing next to them. They locked the doors with a new padlock at 6 o'clock, and Vera drove home and did not eat supper and sat at her kitchen table until after 11 with a legal pad, making a list of what she did not know. The town found out inside of 2 days that she had the doors open. That is not a criticism of the town. It is only how a place of 4,000 people works. By the weekend, 3 separate people had driven down Front Street slowly, and on Sunday, a man Vera did not know knocked and asked if he could see inside, and she said not yet, and he was decent about it. What nobody told her, and what she had no reason to suspect, was that a piece of paper existed at City Hall with the word engines in it. 2 years before the sale, the city had gone looking for a way to get the waterworks taken down without paying that $250,000 for the privilege. What they found was a salvage contractor out of the county seat named Lyle Brummett, who ran a yard on the state highway with a crane and a shear and a set of trucks, and who made his living on precisely this kind of arithmetic. Brummett had walked the plant with the public works director in October of that year. He had spent 40 minutes inside. He had come out and made an offer that the council, in a work session, had found extremely attractive. The offer was that Brummett would demolish the building, the chimney and the foundations, and clear the site to grade, and would perform the abatement through a licensed subcontractor, and would charge the city $62,000 for all of it instead of the number in that engineering report. In exchange, the contract granted him salvage rights. There was a schedule attached listing what he was interested in. The brick, which is worth money in a market that wants old brick, the slate, the roof timbers, which were long, clear pine, the traveling crane, and, on the second page, item 9, the machinery, described as 2 vertical steam pumping engines, associated pumps, piping, valves, and appurtenances. And it was item 9 that had made his arithmetic work, because the bronze and brass in Babbitt and the heavy scrap iron in those 2 machines came to a number that Brummett had figured on the hood of his truck in the parking lot and had liked very much. The contract was signed. It was never performed. It was contingent on the city securing a state site remediation grant to cover the abatement portion, and the city applied twice and did not get it, and after the second denial, the file went into a drawer and the council stopped bringing it up. The contract carried a completion deadline. The deadline passed. Nobody wrote anybody a letter about it. Because in a town that size, nobody writes a letter about a thing everybody has stopped thinking about. Lyle Brummett had not stopped thinking about it. He heard about the sale as everyone in Tolliver County hears about everything, and he did not come the first week and did not call Vera. He called the Public Works director and asked whether the city understood that the machinery in that building was his. The director said he would look into it. What that meant was that he pulled the file, read the first page, saw the words salvage rights, and told Brummett he was probably right, and then went to a meeting about a lift station. On the second Tuesday in April, Vera came down Front Street at 8 a.m, and there was a flatbed with a boom truck behind it parked in her gravel yard, and a pickup and 4 men, and her padlock was lying cut on the ground, and both oak doors were standing wide open. She parked behind the flatbed so it could not leave and got out. Inside the hall, 2 men had run a cutting rig up onto the operating floor between the engines, and one of them was up on the second stage entablature of the west engine with a strap around a brass oiler assembly, and the acetylene was already lit and hissing, and there was a bright white cut about 8 inches long across the upper face of the low-pressure steam chest cover, and the cast iron around it had gone the color of a plum. Vera Lindquist walked out into the middle of her engine hall and stood between the 2 machines and said, in a voice that most people in Ellery had never heard her use, that they would put that out right now. The man with the torch looked at her, then over at Lyle Brummett, who was standing by the crane column with a folder under his arm. Brummett was in his early 60s, a wide, short man with a gray brush cut and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he was polite, which made it worse. He said good morning. He said he understood she had bought the building and that he had no quarrel with her about the building. He said the machinery was a different matter, that he had a contract with the city of Ellery, executed and signed, granting him salvage rights to the machinery in that plant, and that his crew had 4 days scheduled and would be out of her hair by Friday. He held out the folder. Vera did not take the folder. She asked him to shut the torch off first. He looked at her for a second and then made a motion with 2 fingers, and the man on the entablature shut the valves. And the hissing stopped, and the hall got very quiet, quiet enough to hear the pigeons. Then she took the folder. She read the first page standing up, in the light from the arched windows, with her reading glasses out of her cardigan pocket, and Brummett waited, and the 4 men waited, and one of them looked at the floor. She read the second page and the schedule. She turned to the third page and read that, and then she went back to the second page and read 1 paragraph on it twice. She handed the folder back and said that she would like everyone to leave the building and that she was not going to argue with him in front of his men and that she would see him at City Hall. Brummett said, still polite, that he had a contract and a schedule and that a delay cost him money. Vera said that she owned the doors. There was a pause. Then Brummett told his crew to pull the rig back out to the truck and leave it staged in the yard, and they did, and it took 20 minutes, and Vera stood in the doorway the entire time with her hands folded and watched every one of them come out. When the last one was clear, she pulled the doors to and put on a new padlock she had bought that morning for exactly this kind of reason, without knowing that she was buying it for exactly this kind of reason. Then she sat down in her car and her hands started shaking, and she let them, and then she drove to City Hall. Harriet Voss had been the city clerk for many years and had a particular way of receiving bad news, which was to put both forearms on the counter and lean forward slightly and say nothing at all until the other person had finished. Vera finished. Then she took out of her tote bag the one-page deed she had received in March and laid it on the counter and asked Harriet to read the legal description right down to the last line. Harriet put on her glasses. The description began, as they all begin, with a point of commencement at a section corner and ran through 11 courses and distances around the parcel and closed at the point of beginning and contained 1 94/100 acres, more or less. That took 9 lines. Then, in the same small type, without a paragraph break, came a sentence that had been carried forward on every instrument affecting that parcel since the original bond issue, because that is what title companies do. They carry language forward without asking what it is for. The sentence conveyed the above described premises together with the pumping station erected thereon and all engines, pumps, boilers, machinery, apparatus, and fixtures now installed or hereafter installed therein, the same being affixed to and forming part of the freehold, and the whole to be held, conveyed, and encumbered as an entirety, and not in part. Harriet Voss read it out loud in the flat voice she used for reading things out loud, and then stopped, and then read the last 12 words again to herself. There was a reason that sentence existed. In 1908, the city of Ellery had built the waterworks with money it did not have on a revenue bond sold to an investment house in Chicago, and the investment house's lawyers had written the covenant that way on purpose. They did not want a city that got into trouble selling off the engines to make a payment and leaving the bondholders with a brick shed. So they wrote a covenant that welded the machines to the ground legally, the same as they were welded to the ground physically, and made it impossible to convey one without the other, and that covenant went into the ordinance. And out of the ordinance into the mortgage, and out of the mortgage into the release, and then into every deed after that, for 117 years, long after the bonds were paid off and the investment house was gone, and every lawyer who had drafted it was dead. Nobody had ever needed it. So nobody had ever read it. Harriet Voss said, after a while, that she wanted the city attorney to look at this, and Vera said she wanted that too, and asked whether she could have a certified copy of the 1908 ordinance and of the 1994 instrument, and Harriet said she could have anything in that building she wanted a copy of. The city attorney was a woman named Prudence Ellender, who did work for 4 small municipalities and drove between them. She looked at it that Thursday. It took her most of an afternoon, and she came out of it with a memorandum that ran to 5 pages and that the council received the following Monday in a closed session, and then, because the city attorney told them plainly that they were going to have to say this out loud anyway, in open session after it. The memorandum said 3 things. It said, first, that the sentence in the legal description was not surplus language and was not a recital, but an operative granting clause, and that the deed the city delivered to Vera Lindquist in March had conveyed the parcel, the pumping station, and every engine, pump, boiler, and fixture installed in it, and that the conveyance was complete on delivery and recording, and that the city had retained nothing. It said, second, that the salvage agreement with Brummett Salvage and Excavating was not a conveyance of the machinery. It was a contract for demolition services with a compensation term that included the right to take salvage from the work. The right to take salvage arose only upon and in the course of performance of the demolition. And the machinery had never been severed, delivered, or transferred. Furthermore, the contract had by its own terms expired on a date 22 months previous, having been contingent on a grant award the city never received, and no extension had ever been executed. Whatever Brummett had, he no longer had it, and what he had never had was title. It said, third, and this was the paragraph the council took the worst, that if the city had performed that contract, if the grant had come through, and Brummett's crew had gone in and cut those engines up in the ordinary course, the city would have been demolishing property it had covenanted since 1908 to keep with the freehold, and would very likely have been liable for it. And that the city had come closer to a serious problem than anyone in the room had understood at the time. Perry Ostrin was the city manager. He had been in the job 11 years and was competent and tired. He asked the attorney one question in open session, which was whether there was any argument by which the city could take the machinery back, and Prudence Ellender said no, there was not. The city sold it, and the fact that the city did not know what it was selling did not create a claim. Then a council member asked what the machinery was worth. Prudence Ellender said she had no idea, and that she was not sure anybody in the room did. Lyle Brummett got a letter from the city attorney and did not accept it. He hired a lawyer in the county seat who wrote back twice, and the second letter was noticeably shorter than the first, and then in June he came out to Front Street on his own and knocked and asked Vera whether she would sell him the West engine. She said no. He asked what she would take for the crane, and she said she would think about it, which was true. And she thought about it, and the answer was also no. He stood in the yard for a minute and looked up at the chimney and said that whatever she thought she had in there, the roof was going to take it away from her inside of 5 years. Then he shook her hand, which she had not expected, and left, and after that he was not part of it anymore, except as the person everybody in town brought up when they wanted to say how close it had come. The roof was not a bluff. Theo had been up in the crane girders with a light, and there were 3 places in the valley on the north slope where daylight came through. And the plaster on the inside face of the north wall had a bloom of white salt on it, a story high. So the first money Vera Lindquist spent on that building was not spent on the engines. It went on the roof. She got 2 bids and took the higher one because the higher one came from a company that had done church slate, and they worked 11 days in May and June and replaced 240 slates, rebuilt both valleys in copper, and reflashed around the chimney base, and it cost her $9,460, which she paid out of the rest of the certificate of deposit. And after that she had, in the world, her house, her car, $140 in checking, and a monthly benefit. Corinne, when she found out, drove up from Davenport, and they had the worst 2 hours they had ever had at Vera's kitchen table, and Corinne cried and said that her mother was going to lose the house over a pile of scrap iron, and Vera said that it was not scrap iron. And Corinne said that was exactly what it was. That was the whole point. That is what everybody says it is. And Vera said quietly that she wanted Corinne to come and look at it before she said that word again. Corinne would not go that day. She went in July. Meanwhile, Theo Bracken had been coming to the plant 3 days a week for what Vera could pay him, which was not much, and for the first several weeks they did nothing at all to the engines. They cleaned the building. They carried out 60 some years of pigeon mess in buckets. They took the plywood off the inside of the lower window sashes on the riverside, 1 window at a time. Working from a scaffold Theo borrowed, and every window they opened up changed the room. That was the part Vera had not anticipated. She had thought of the building as a container for the machines. What she came to understand over those weeks was that the room and the machines were one thing, that the arched windows had been set at that height and that spacing so that light would fall across the floor and along the columns at every hour, that the whole hall had been designed by somebody to be looked at, and that for 46 years it had been looked at by nobody. On the last Saturday in June, they took the plywood off the final 4 windows facing the water, and Theo came down off the scaffold, and they walked to the north end of the hall together and turned around. It was about 4 in the afternoon. The sun was across the river and coming in low and long, and it came through 22 arched openings at once and struck the west engine full on down its whole height, and the brass bands on the cylinder lagging, which Theo had cleaned that week with nothing but kerosene and a cloth, threw the light back down the whole hall in flat, bright ribbons. The columns took it up the sides. The high entablature sat in it. 40 feet up, the high-pressure cylinder head had a dome on it like the cap of an acorn, and it was in full sun, and 40 feet down, the flywheel rim came out of the shadow of the bedplate and went up into the light. The dust in the air made every one of those long slants visible from end to end. Theo Bracken sat down on the edge of a foundation block with his forearms on his knees. Vera stood where she was for a long time and then said that when she was 11 years old, she had put her hand on that machine while it was moving. Here is what she owned, measured, because that summer she went and measured it, with Theo holding the other end of the tape and writing on a scrap of cardboard. Each engine, from the operating floor to the crown of the tallest cylinder head, 40 feet and 4 inches. Bedplate length, 46 feet. Flywheel diameter, 18 feet. Rim face, 22 inches. Weight given on the builder's plate as 51 tons. 3 cylinders per engine, high pressure, intermediate and low pressure. The low pressure bore given as 72 inches, which is a hole 6 feet across that a person can stand inside of. Stroke, 60 inches. Rated capacity 12 million gallons per day at a speed of 18 revolutions per minute. Total weight of one engine from the erection drawings, which were rolled up in a tin tube in the office, 740,000 pounds. 18 revolutions per minute. That was the thing Theo kept coming back to. It meant that when those engines were running, the flywheel, which is 7 feet around, went by at a walking pace, and the crossheads came up and went down slower than a person breathes, and you could stand next to 740,000 pounds of moving iron and hear a bird outside. That is why Reuben Kastner had been able to let a row of 6th graders put their hands on it. There was one more set of numbers she copied out that summer, and she found them in the annual reports bound in a cabinet in the office. Between the morning the first engine was started and the afternoon, Orville Kastner shut the second one down. Those 2 machines had pumped a little over 190 billion gallons of water into the town of Ellery. They had done it through the influenza autumn when the schools were shut, through the flood in the spring when the river came up over Delacourt Street and the crew slept in the office for 9 days and kept the plant running with the water standing a foot deep in the boiler room. Through 2 wars. Through the ice storm that took the electric service down for 11 days in the winter Vera was 4 years old, when the pump house was the only building on that side of the river with heat and light and running water in it, and the town knew it, and people walked down there with buckets. Every glass of water anybody in Ellery had drunk for 71 years had come up out of the ground and gone through one of those 2 machines. Vera had lived her whole life on the far side of a brick wall from that fact and had never once put it to herself in those terms, and neither had anybody else in town, and it seemed to her. Sitting on the checker plate with a pencil and the annual reports across her knees, that this was the ordinary condition of nearly everything that holds a place together. It works. Nobody looks at it. It stops. Somebody writes down what it will cost to haul it away. She put that in the back of the spiral notebook she had started in April, and she did not show it to anybody for 2 years. And then she read it out loud at a preservation conference in Minneapolis in front of 300 people who had not expected a woman of 75 in a darned cardigan to be the best speaker of the weekend. Corinne came the second weekend in July with her husband and their boy on their way to somewhere else, and it was clear from the driveway that she intended to look at it for 10 minutes and be reasonable about it afterward. Vera let them in the front and took them through the vestibule and the office wing first, on purpose. and then opened the glass paneled door and stood back and let her daughter go through ahead of her. Corinne got about 15 feet into the hall and stopped. She stood there with her purse on her shoulder and her sunglasses still pushed up in her hair and said nothing for the better part of a minute. Then she walked forward slowly out onto the floor, turning as she went. And at the flywheel end of the east engine, she stopped again and put her hand out and did not quite touch it and pulled her hand back. Her son, who was 14 and had come in expecting to be bored, went straight up the gallery stairs 2 at a time before anybody could tell him not to. Corinne said, eventually, and not to anybody in particular, that nobody had told her. Vera said she had tried to. Corinne said no, that was not what she meant. She meant that nobody in Ellery had told her. She had grown up 11 blocks from this building. Her father had worked on these. She had driven past that brick wall her entire childhood, and she had understood the waterworks to be a shut-down utility plant with a bad chimney, because that is what everyone said it was. Because everyone who had ever been inside had gotten old and stopped saying anything, and the ones who were left said the chimney. They stayed 4 hours. They did not get to where they were going that night. Word went out from there in the ordinary channels, which is to say through Corinne to her cousins and through Theo to 2 other millwrights he knew, and through a photograph that Theo took on the last Saturday in June and put on a forum for people who care about stationary engines without any explanation attached to it beyond the town and the builder's name off the plate. That photograph went a long way in a small world. By the middle of August, Vera Lindquist had a shoebox of printed emails because she did not like reading on the telephone and had Theo print them at the library. There were letters from Michigan, from a preservation trust in Massachusetts, from a man in Britain who had spent 30 years on a similar engine and wrote 4 pages, and from 3 museums. 2 of the museums wanted to know whether the engines could be acquired and moved. Theo Bracken answered that one at the kitchen table by asking what they thought a machine of that weight would be after you cut it into pieces small enough to put on trucks, and Vera wrote back to both museums politely and said no. The 3rd letter was different. It was from a woman named Margit Solberg, who was a curator of industrial collections at a state historical trust 200 miles north, and who was also one of a handful of people in the country who did formal appraisals of large historic machinery for insurance and grant purposes. Her letter did not ask to acquire anything. It asked, in 2 paragraphs, whether the builder's plate really read what the photograph appeared to show it read, and whether both engines were still standing on their original foundations, and whether the flywheels were still on the shafts. Vera wrote back yes, yes, and yes. Margit Solberg drove down on the 9th of September and arrived at 9 in the morning and stayed until it was dark. She was in her late 50s, tall, gray hair cut short, and she came in work boots and a canvas jacket with a folding rule in the pocket and a camera on a strap. She shook Vera's hand in the gravel yard and said she had been thinking about this drive for 3 weeks. Then Vera opened the oak doors, and Margit Solberg walked into the engine hall and stopped in exactly the place everybody stopped, about 8 feet inside the threshold where the room opens up. She stood there so long that Vera finally asked whether she was all right. Margit Solberg said, without turning around, that she needed a minute. She spent the whole morning on the east engine and did not say very much. She went up the gallery stairs and along the 2nd level and up to the 3rd. And she photographed the builder's plate from 4 angles and the erection dates cast into the bed plate and the pattern numbers on the column feet. She wiped a patch of the low-pressure piston rod herself with a rag and looked at the steel and then looked at it again with a glass. She got down on the floor with a light and looked under the bed plate at the foundation bolts and the grout line. She went into the office wing and unrolled the erection drawings on the desk and sat with them for 40 minutes. At noon, Vera made sandwiches and they ate them sitting on the foundation blocks, and Margit Solberg asked how many people had been in this building since March, and Vera counted and said 9, including Corinne's boy. In the afternoon, she did the West Engine, and she did it faster because by then she knew what she was looking at. And at about 4 o'clock, she came down off the gallery stairs and walked the length of the hall to where Vera was standing beside the pit rail, and Vera watched her come and saw that something had changed in her face. Margit Solberg had gone white around the mouth. She stopped and set her camera down on the rail carefully, as a person sets a thing down when they do not entirely trust their hands, and she said that she meant to say some numbers out loud and that she wanted to say them once and be careful about it. She said that the builder had gone out of business in 1931, that the builder had erected somewhere around 250 vertical triple expansion pumping engines of this class in North America between 1894 and 1926. That by her own count, and she had maintained that count for 19 years, 12 of them survived anywhere in the world in any condition. That of those 12, 4 were still standing where they had been erected in their original engine houses. That of those 4, 1 was in a plant that had been gutted around it, and 2 were single engines, the mates having been cut up decades ago, and that this building on Front Street in Ellery held the only matched pair left standing together on their original foundations. Under their original crane, in their original hall, with their flywheels on their shafts and their erection drawings in a tin tube in the office, laid up in 1979 by a man who had done it correctly and had written down what he did. She said that she had not expected the pair. She had driven down for 1 engine. Then she gave the number. She said that for insurance and grant purposes, she would appraise the pair in situ as a preserved historic installation at $410,000, and that she wanted to be honest that this figure was conservative and was constrained by the condition of the building around them and by the fact that appraisal standards required her to be conservative. She said the replacement cost, meaning what it would cost today to have 2 machines like this designed, patterned, cast, machined, erected, and aligned, if there were anyone left who could do it, which there was not, was somewhere north of $11 million, and that this figure was not useful to anybody, but that Vera should know it existed. She said last, and she said this part looking at the floor, that the scrap value of the 2 engines, the bronze and the brass and the Babbitt and the iron, at the price a yard would pay that week, was about $58,000. Vera Lindquist did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked Margit Solberg to say the last one again. Margit said $58,000. Vera said that a man had been standing on that entablature in April with a lit torch. Margit Solberg said she knew. Theo had told her at lunch, and that she had thought about it all afternoon and had not been able to stop thinking about it, and that in her 19 years she had watched 6 of the 12 go, that in every single case the reason was that a piece of paper somewhere said machinery, and nobody who read that paper knew what the word meant. And that this was the first time in her working life she had walked into a building and found that the paper had gone the other direction. The formal appraisal report came in the mail 11 days later. It ran to 62 pages with the photographs. Vera read all of it at her kitchen table over 3 evenings, and then she put it in the shoebox with the letters. And then she took it back out and drove it down to City Hall and left a copy at the counter for Harriet Voss with a note that said she thought the city ought to have one for its file. Harriet Voss called her at home that night, which she had never done before, and said she had gotten through the first 20 pages and had to stop and call. The council saw it at the first meeting in October. It was a long meeting. Perry Ostrand read out the paragraph about the 12 survivors and the 4 on original foundations, and then the paragraph with the appraised figure, and then he stopped and did not read the paragraph about the scrap value, and a council member asked him to read that one too, and he did. Then a man in the audience. The concrete contractor who had been standing by the door in March when the bid was opened asked whether he could say something, and the mayor said he could. He said he was the one who had made the joke that morning about the privilege of owing $250,000. He said he had thought about that joke a number of times since. He said he would like it in the minutes that he was wrong. It is in the minutes. Vera had known since April where Orville Kastner lived and had not gone and could not have told anybody exactly why. She went in October on a Sunday afternoon and took the operating log with her on the passenger seat wrapped in a dish towel. The house was out east on the Hollis Road, a low ranch with a shop building behind it and a windbreak of spruce he had planted himself. His daughter answered the door. Orville Kastner was 91 and used a walker to get across a room and did not use one to get across the yard because he did not have to go across the yard anymore. He was in a recliner by the window with the television off. Vera introduced herself twice, the second time by her maiden name, and he got it then and said her father had run the milk route. She sat down and put the wrapped ledger on her knees and said that she had bought the waterworks in March. He said he knew that. She said she had found his log. Orville Kastner looked at the towel on her lap for a while and then said, and this was the first thing he said that was not small talk, that he had gone down there the week they announced the shutdown and had asked the superintendent what was going to happen to the engines and had been told they would be cut up inside a year, probably in the spring, and that he should not put anything into laying them up because it was money out the window. He said he laid them up anyway. He said it took him and one other man 9 days after the last shift. He said he did it on his own time for 6 of those days because the overtime got denied. He said he had waited that whole first year for the trucks and the trucks did not come. And then he had waited the second year. And then, he said, somewhere in about the 4th or 5th year, he had understood that he was going to spend the rest of his life driving past that building not knowing, and he had made his peace with that and had not been down Front Street on purpose since about 1988. Vera unwrapped the ledger and opened it to the last page and turned it around and put it in his hands. He held it and looked at his own writing for a long moment and then read the last line, the one that was not a log entry, the one about whoever came next, and his mouth went unsteady and he pressed his thumb flat on the page. Vera said that she was whoever came next. Then she asked him whether he would be willing to come down and tell her and a young millwright named Theo Bracken what they had, because between the two of them, they had a pair of machines from 1908 and a set of drawings and nobody alive who had ever run one. Orville Kastner came on the following Wednesday. His daughter drove him. He got out of the car in the yard and stood there looking at the north wall for a bit and then said the brick had been repointed on that corner and asked who had done it, and Vera said she had in August, and he said it was a good job. Then he went inside and through the vestibule, and Theo held the glass-paneled door. He stopped where everybody stopped. Then he walked out onto the floor of the engine hall without the walker, one hand on Theo's forearm, past the east engine to the middle, and he looked up the height of it into the light from the arched windows, and then he turned around slowly in a full circle and looked at the crane at the north end, still secured where he had left it, and he said out loud to nobody that they had not touched a thing. He came twice a week after that from October until the spring. He walked Theo Bracken through every system in that plant, standing up at 91 for 2 and 3 hours at a time, and when he could not stand anymore, he sat on a foundation block and kept talking. He knew where the special wrenches were. In a wooden box under the machinist's bench in the shop bay, and they were there. He knew that the low-pressure valve gear on the West engine had a shim under the eccentric strap that was not on the drawing, put there in 1966, and it was there. He knew which of the 4 boilers had been retubed last, and therefore, which one, if anybody ever fired one again, ought to be the one. And he was very clear that he was not recommending that anybody fire anything. Theo bought a spiral notebook and filled it and bought another one. That winter, the town changed its mind about Vera Lindquist, and it did not do it all at once, and it did not do it because of the appraisal figure, although the figure was what got read out at the council meeting and repeated at the cafe. What did it was smaller and slower? It was that people started going inside. Vera had started letting people in one Saturday morning a month, 4 at a time by appointment, because her insurance would not let her do more than that, and because she was 73 and could not do more than that. There was no charge. She stood in the middle of the floor in her cardigan and told them what they were looking at, and after about the 3rd month, she stopped explaining and started letting the room do it, because she had noticed that everyone stopped talking on their own about 8 feet inside the door. The Saturday list was booked out 5 months by February. Ellery is a town where the fire department dinner is the event of the year. By the middle of that winter, the waterworks had passed the fire department dinner. The high school sent its whole physics section down in 2 groups. The nursing home 2 towns over asked whether they could bring a bus, and Vera said yes, and then went and had a handrail put on the gallery stairs at her own expense before they came. 3 men in their 80s who had worked in the shop with Ansel came together on a Saturday in January and stood under the flywheel of the West engine for 40 minutes. And Margit Solberg had not been idle 200 miles north. What she had done was assemble, out of the trust she worked for, and a national preservation fund and a foundation attached to an association of water utilities, an offer. And it took her until March to get all 3 of them to the same table, and she brought it to Vera's kitchen on the 2nd of April. Almost exactly 1 year after the men with the torch. The offer was not a purchase. Margit had been explicit with all 3 funders that the engines could not leave that building and remain what they were, and that anybody who paid to move them would be paying to destroy them. What the 3 of them proposed was a preservation easement. Vera would keep the property. She would grant a permanent easement running with the land recorded that bound her and every owner after her to keep the 2 engines, the crane and the hall intact and in place, and to allow reasonable public access on a schedule. In exchange, the funders would pay her $165,000 and would separately fund a stabilization program administered by the trust of $230,000 over 4 years for the chimney, the abatement of the steam line insulation by a licensed contractor, the pit gallery, the windows, and the mechanical conservation of both engines. There was a 4th piece that Margit put in the memorandum herself. The stabilization program included a salaried position for 4 years for an on-site millwright. She had written the qualifications in a way that fit exactly 1 person in the state of Iowa, and she did not pretend otherwise, and Theo Bracken read that paragraph twice at the kitchen table and then had to go stand in the driveway for a minute. Vera signed in May. The abatement contractor worked 6 weeks. The chimney was surveyed by an engineer who came up in a lift and reported that the upper section could be rebuilt rather than felled at a cost, and it was rebuilt, 22 feet of it, in the original brick. And when they took the scaffold down in September, the Hawk came back inside of 4 days. And in the second autumn, they turned an engine, not on steam. Orville Kastner would not hear of steam, and Theo agreed with him, and the trust's engineer agreed with both of them. Firing a boiler that had been cold since 1979 was a thing you did after years of work and inspection, if ever, and not for an occasion. What they did instead was rig the barring gear. Every engine of that class has one. A small gear drive that meshes with teeth cut into the flywheel rim put there so that the operators could turn that entire mass of machinery slowly by hand to set it for starting. On the east engine, the barring gear was intact. Theo and 2 millwrights from the trust spent 5 weeks getting the east engine ready to be turned 1 full revolution, which meant checking every bearing, flushing and refilling every oil cup and reservoir, easing the piston rod packing, opening the cylinder drains, and satisfying themselves about every single thing that could bind. They set it for the 4th Saturday in October. They expected perhaps 150 people. The county road department ended up parking cars in the field across from the plant. And the county newspaper put the number at 900, and the fire department served coffee out of the back of a truck in the gravel yard. They opened both oak doors and let people fill the hall along the walls and up on both gallery levels, and it was a bright, cold morning, and every window along that wall was open to the light, and the room was full, and the room was completely silent. Because a room like that does something to a crowd that no one has ever adequately explained. Orville Kastner was 92 by then. They had brought a chair for him at the flywheel end, and he did not sit in it. He stood at the barring gear with his daughter's hand under his elbow and Theo Bracken beside him, and Vera Lindquist stood on the operating floor about 15 feet away in her oatmeal cardigan and her brown lace-up shoes with her hands folded in front of her. Theo asked him if he was ready. Orville put both hands on the bar. It did not move on the first pull or the second. On the third, the whole engine went over center with a low sound that came up out of the floor rather than out of the machine, and the flywheel began to turn. 18 feet across and 51 tons, and it came around at the speed of a slow walk, and the connecting rod swung down, and the crosshead started up the guides 40 feet overhead. And the sun through the arched windows went along the polished rod in a moving bar of white, and everyone in that hall watched a thing go up and come down that had not gone up and come down since the 14th of October, 1979. It took a little over 3 minutes to complete 1 revolution because they turned it slowly on purpose. There was no cheering. Somebody near the back said something and somebody shushed them. At the top of the stroke, where the crosshead pauses for an instant before it comes back down, you could hear the oil dripping. When the crank came back around to bottom center, Theo held up his hand, and Orville Kastner eased off the bar and stepped back 1 step and put his hand flat on the flywheel rim, which was still, and stood there with his head down. Then, and only then, 900 people made noise. Afterward, when the yard had emptied out and the fire department had taken the coffee urn away, Vera walked the empty hall end to end in the late light with Margit Solberg, and Margit asked her what she was going to do with it in the long run, meaning after, and neither of them said after what. Vera had already done it. He had done it in July, quietly, at the same title company on Sedgwick Street, with the same young woman named Tilda running the papers. She had recorded a new deed. It conveyed the parcel and the pumping station and everything in it into a non-profit corporation formed for that purpose, with a board of 5, and it reserved to Vera Lindquist a life estate, which meant she owned and controlled it for as long as she lived, and it belonged to the town after that. And under the granting clause, in ordinary size type where anybody could see it, she had had the attorney set out, word for word, the sentence from 1908, the one the bondholders' lawyers had written to protect a loan that was repaid before the Second World War. The one that had traveled through 6 conveyances and 117 years unread, the one that says the engines, pumps, boilers, machinery, apparatus, and fixtures are affixed to and form part of the freehold, and that the whole is to be held and conveyed as an entirety and not in part. Then she had added 1 sentence of her own underneath it, which the attorney told her was legally unnecessary and which she wanted anyway. It said that the sentence above had once been the only thing standing between the machinery in this building and a cutting torch, that it had done that work without anybody knowing it was doing it, and that it was being restated here so that the next person to read this deed would read it all the way to the end. Lyle Brummett's crane and shear are still on the state highway. He came to the turning. He stood up on the second gallery near the back and did not talk to anybody and left before the coffee. Corinne is on the board of the nonprofit. She drives up from Davenport for the meetings, and she brought her boy back that first summer for 3 weeks. And he swept floors and cleaned brass and is now in his second year of a mechanical engineering program, and when people ask him why, he tells them about a room in Iowa. Theo Bracken finished the 4-year millwright position, and the trust extended it and then made it permanent, and he and his wife bought a house on Delacorte Street, 11 blocks from the plant. And he is the person who now stands out on the operating floor on Saturdays and lets the room do the explaining. Harriet Voss retired from City Hall and volunteers at the front desk on the first Saturday of every month. She has said more than once to people who come through that she was the one who opened the envelope, and that she has thought a great deal since then about the difference between reading a document and reading a document all the way to the end. Orville Kastner lived 2 more years. He was at the plant most weeks until the last 4 months. At his funeral in the spring, the family asked that instead of flowers, people give to the Waterworks Fund, and they did. And it came to $11,400 from a town of 4,000 people. His last log entry, the one on the bottom of that final page, is framed on the wall of the office wing beside the drawings, and it is the one thing in that building most visitors stop and read twice. Vera Lindquist is 76 now. She still comes down 4 days a week. She has a chair in the office wing and a small electric kettle, and in the afternoon, when the sun has gotten around to the riverside, she takes her tea out and sits on a foundation block at the north end of the hall where she can see the whole length of it. She paid $4,180 for that building. The town had priced its destruction at $260,000 and had a signed contract to have the machinery in it cut into pieces for scrap, and had come by the calendar about 4 days short of doing it. What she actually bought, though she had no idea of it, and neither did anybody who sold it to her, was 1 page with 9 lines of directions on it, and then 1 long sentence that nobody had read since before either war, sitting there patient in the small type at the bottom, doing its job. That is generally where it is.